Thank you very much for joining us once again on another one of our Safer at Home series of talks. As you know, these are brought to you by Cape Cod 5, First Citizens Federal Credit Union, Martha's Vineyard Savings, and all of our books in the series are available at Eight Cousins Bookseller in Falmouth. So please make sure you patronize a small business. And I do believe there's rumors that Christmas is coming. So if you need to get a little shopping in case you missed the memo, it's still coming. And as well as our first real snowstorm. So get ready to buckle up later this week. Our speaker tonight, LeeAnna Keith, teaches history at the Collegiate School in New York City, which LeeAnna, I believe, is the oldest school in the United States, if I'm right.
Or at least we like to say so. We like to say so.
And she's also written a book about the Colfax Massacre. But as you know, this is the 155th anniversary of the end of the Civil War. And the Reconstruction period, I know for me, I find it fascinating. And yes, it does show that there was a time that Congress got along even worse than they do these days. So without further ado, would you welcome our speaker, LeeAnna Keith?
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. And I really appreciate your scholarly commitment, right? Tuning in when you don't get the benefits of actually going into the bookstore, where I'm sure that it's a lovely place with snacks and decorations, and you have your comradeship and fellowship. So thank you for spending time hearing a little bit about my book and my take on what the Civil War era has to say to us today. My book is about the Republican Party. During the founding era, the Republican Party, which was established in 1854, and I look at the period 1854 to 1865, just to the end of the war. But in focusing on the radical Republicans, my book is not only about the 1850s and the Civil War, but it's also about the group that's going to take us out of the war into Reconstruction, and it's going to pioneer all these truly radical social changes, such as citizenship rights and voting rights, at least for Black men in the southern states, efforts to give them a boost, the formerly enslaved population, into full citizenship and prosperity as Americans. And of course, that was a mission that was met with tremendous violence and also with a tremendous federal government effort to make things work. So in my remarks today, I want to talk about when it was grand, the party, 1854 to 1865. And I also have a sense of, and hope that you'll share with me a sense of the fact that these individuals, men and women, Black and white, who make up the radical Republican movement, their act, we're looking at the first act in their drama, which is followed by the Reconstruction period and all of its drama. And in many ways, I feel the ghosts of the Civil War and Reconstruction visit us today in 2020 and in recent years. There has been a series of events that evoke some of the high drama and partisanship of the Civil War era, for better and for worse. And before we really go any farther into that idea, I want to take some advice from my students. Now, I teach in a high school, and my students are quite capable and determined. I work them through quite a bit of history, especially in the 10th grade, where I teach U.S. history to 10th graders. And I was teaching today, and I was actually teaching about the Civil War era. And my students said, and I told them I was doing this tonight, my students said, be sure to tell them about the differences between the Republicans and Democrats of today and the Republicans and Democrats of yesteryear. Be sure to try and explain, they said, the way that we're not talking about your uncle's GOP or Joe Biden's Democratic Party when we talk about the events of the Civil War era. I don't mean to suggest that the two parties have switched roles in the 155 years since the end of the war. But I do want to say that they have adopted a lot of the ideas that are associated with the other party. For example, the Republicans of yesteryear, like today's Democrats, were the more inclusive party when it came to race, the more inclusive party when it came to gender, the party that was more interested in redistributing wealth from the top of the social spectrum toward the bottom. And in many ways, yesterday's Republicans were much more radicalized and committed to these goals than the Democratic Party is today. And similarly, sometimes people will say that today's Republican Party has made a place for white nationalists, for racists, that it has, that it's not the party for African Americans. But today's Republican Party is in no way as backward-looking, racist, and intent on keeping people from moving up the social scale as yesterday's Democrats, right? The Democrats of the Civil War era and Reconstruction, and for many years afterwards, in fact, were the party of white supremacy. And that changeover to the parties that we're familiar with now takes place gradually and over a long period of time, with some key events that you may be aware of, because obviously you're all history buffs if you're here, that the 1912 election makes a big difference, that the whole New Deal era makes a big difference, that there are major realignments that come out of the Civil Rights Movement and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And so I just want to put that out right away, that we're not talking about movements that have ideological continuity between those days and our time. And yet, there are ways in which you can see elements of both of today's political extremes, if you will, in the radical Republican movement of the 19th century, which was a movement of extremists. The radical Republicans of yesteryear evoke today's Republican Party extremists in certain ways. For example, like today's Trump deplorables, those Republicans embraced what was meant as an insult, the reference to this group of people as representing the mudsills and mechanics, the low and dirty population of working people, working men, which was a label that the Republicans embraced, right, with slogans like mudsills and mechanics for A. Lincoln. This was also a movement that was quite media savvy. Many of the participants were owners of newspapers, publishers themselves, who had come up with innovative ways of representing what they believe. For example, in the masthead of the newspaper, which could reach not only readers, but also illiterates with the kind of imagery that it included. They are media savvy also in that they are sponsors of satire, satirical music, and concerts and plays. This is also a group like today's deplorables that is deeply committed to conspiracy theory. In the case of the radical Republicans, their conspiracy theory happens to be true, that they believe that the United States government and our whole social order, but especially the federal government, is under the control of a slave power conspiracy that was in the 1850s seeking to expand the prerogatives of slaveholding, to make slaveholding permanent, to expand slaveholding into new territories in defiance of what abolitionists and Republicans believed was the appropriate natural order. And it's also true that the Republicans of the Civil War era bore in common with today's radical Republican movements a fascination with armament, with stockpiling weapons, and with forming militias. Excuse me, I have a bossy dog here I have to attend. In other ways, the radical Republicans of the 19th century shared goals and values with today's leftists inside the Democratic Party and leftists who also operate outside the Democratic Party. Like today's leftists, the radical Republicans in the past were believers in big government. They felt that they had seen what big government could do for the slaveholding interests and all the ways that slaveholders made government work for them and forwarding their ideas and interests. This movement in the 19th century was more feminist than most social movements of the 19th century. And in fact, even though women are not empowered as voters, many radical Republican men are feminists and women's suffrage advocates. And it's also true that this party of the 19th century is less racist. And even from the beginning, it included African American men and some women on the fringes. And by the end of the movement, by the end of the Civil War, by the end of my book, a large number of influential, respected, and central players who were African Americans, going into the Reconstruction period when Republicans will elect Black men to the United States Senate, to the Congress, and to offices at every level, state and local. Another way that these guys evoke today's leftist movement is in their intention to move wealth down the social scale. The most obvious way was in the movement to confiscate rebel estates and redistribute property so that those who had formerly been held in bondage could become landholders, which was seen in the 19th century as an entree into citizenship, full citizenship. It's also true that the Republicans of that era sponsored upward movement policies that were blind to color, policies like the Homestead Act, which passed Congress in 1862, or the Morrill Land Grant College Act, which really changed the landscape of American education. I mean, there are bootstrappers who are interested in using government to help people climb the social ladder. And the last way that the Republicans of yesteryear remind us of some elements of today's leftist movements is in their focus on what they consider the greatest threat to their society, their civilization. In the era of the Civil War, that threat obviously was slavery and the divisions surrounding slavery. They call themselves wolf killers in celebrating the victories that they take during the war against the slaveholding system. And in my opinion, people on the left have a more clear view of today's existential threat, which is climate change, right? Here's a movement that's coming square with the wolf of our own time, which is our changing environment. And just like there are elements of the political movements that remind us of vital political issues today, there are also a number of events and new scrutiny and consideration of roles for public officials that popped up during the Civil War era and during Reconstruction that remain hot button issues, and that especially as we have been going through the experiences of 2020, so many discussions about personal liberty, so much political tension and debate around election procedures, and some attention also to the role of the courts. Civil War era extremism and scrutiny of the role of public officials also lives today, right? In the way we evaluate the work of our sheriffs, of our prosecutors, the roles for federal marshals, and in the Civil War era, of course, also for provost marshals and Freedmen's Bureau agents who were empowered with sort of military police authority. Also controversies surrounding voting. In my book, we see the corruption of elections, especially in Kansas, by the use of tactics I describe as the tactics of pirates and filibusters. We see the expansion of absentee voting for the first time as Republicans helped to organize votes for soldiers in the field in the 1864 election. We see the use of the Army in 1867 and 1868 to register voters, especially Black voters, and to protect them in their exercise of the right to vote, to accompany them to the polls. And once Klan violence and other forms of resistance, fraud, intimidation regarding elections sets in the 1860s and 1870s, we see a huge commitment to federal oversight of elections with the Enforcement Acts and Ku Klux Klan Acts, and in incidents like the Colfax Massacre and its prosecution. So, having said all that and talked about the resonances between the Civil War era and today, I want to make it clear that my book is not about today, right? When it was grand, it's really firmly about the past. It's about the 1850s and the 1860s and the radical faction of the Republican Party. And I just want to walk through with you a list of what makes a person a radical Republican in the 1850s and in the 1860s. First, and as you saw in the images, I hope, to be a radical Republican meant to participate in the colonization of Kansas by anti-slavery Northerners. The Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854 had created the Republican Party by creating a race to settle what had been designated to be a slavery-free zone in the Louisiana Purchase. Right? The Missouri Compromise had promised that any state that entered the Union, except for Missouri, in the huge expanse that was called Louisiana, would enter as a free state. But the bad faith of the pro-slavery forces who had helped to negotiate that compromise had meant that Kansas was not developed. And when the Kansas-Nebraska bill is passed, it allows for the possibility that a slave state will be established, and it hints strongly that that slave state will be Kansas, adjacent to the slave state of Missouri, and that other territories in Nebraska, elsewhere in Louisiana, might enter as free states. Radical Republicans reject that kind of compromising, and they determine that Kansas, regardless of its proximity to Missouri, will be a free state, and they organize immigration, sponsored immigration of anti-slavery individuals and families in Kansas. As many of you know, this becomes an armed conflict that requires the stockpiling of weapons, the formation of militias, and armed conflict between the two factions, ultimately resolving in favor. Ultimately, it's a victory for radical republicanism that the free state forces prevail in Kansas. Another thing that makes you a radical is to participate in the operations to interfere with the operations of the Fugitive Slave Act. That was a law passed in 1850 that made the central government so strong in behalf of slaveholders, that equipped them with the power to establish commissions, tribunals to hear charges against accused fugitives, that limited what those fugitives could say in their own defense, right? In fact, prohibited them from giving testimony, and that paid the commissioners involved in the rendition processes more money, twice as much, if they agreed with the plaintiff that the individual brought before the court was indeed a fugitive slave. 10 times more fugitives were remanded into slavery between 1850 and 1860 than had been captured and returned during the whole period between 1789 and 1850. And radical Republicans and others organized resistance to those processes, vigilance committees that follow federal marshals around to see what they're up to. They raise crowds, they print handbills, they actually engage in acts of violence to seize the persons who are held in the slave rendition process, battering rams, boxes of axes to chop down courtroom doors, guns, and people are killed. And in part, this movement, which is broader than just the Republican Party, helps to empower the most radical faction in the Republican Party just as it's being formed. Right? And like so much of what I talk about in my book, here you are in Massachusetts, which comes off in my book as by far the greatest state in the Union, with a wonderful commitment to abolishing slavery and the other goals. Those radicals in the Boston Vigilance Committee are going to be very influential players in the whole formation of the Republican Party and its first presidential candidates. Another radical movement is a movement to resist the Dred Scott doctrine, the doctrine laid down in the case Dred and Harriet Scott versus Sanford, a man and wife who sued for their freedom based on the fact that the man who claimed to own them had carried them into free territory. And those of you who know the story know that the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court handed down an opinion in which he did two things that you shouldn't be able to do together, right? He dismisses Dred's suit on the grounds that Dred is not a citizen and a black man cannot be a citizen and has no rights. Then he goes on to rule on the merits of the case, saying that the Missouri Compromise and any ban on slavery in the territories was illegitimate, which is actually a way of saying that the whole Republican Party is based on an unconstitutional idea that the slavery system could be confined to where it existed now. Radical Republicans reject that idea, and they not only denounce these opinions in the newspapers and in personal conversations, but they take the fight to state legislatures in New York State, in Massachusetts, in Wisconsin, in Vermont. Legislatures pass nullification resolutions saying that the opinions in the Dred Scott case are not binding in their states, and that in contrast to what the Chief Justice had argued, black men did have rights in their states that white people were bound to uphold. And while they're at it, some of them also pass resolutions nullifying the Fugitive Slave Act, saying you can come to New York State and try to claim a person as a slave, but if we convict you of doing that, you're going to pay a huge fine and you're going to go to prison, 2 years sentence at hard labor for trying to take someone as your slave in New York State. It's unconstitutional, but this is a movement in defiance of the law. As the Civil War comes into view, radical Republicans will counsel against compromise. And in fact, they look forward to war and disunion as the opportunity they've been waiting for to try to get some real change in American life. Not only do they want to go to war, but once war gets underway, they're not looking for a quick and easy victory for the United States. The radical Republicans like the idea of hard war. Hard war is what's going to convince Americans of the necessity of addressing this problem of slavery. And so they lean in, following the wisdom of Ralph Waldo Emerson, who's one of my radical Republican characters, who said, yeah, good is a good doctor, but bad is sometimes better. Right? We have to really lance this wound, this boil that has poisoned the American bloodstream. Once war is underway, radicals seek to use the war to achieve emancipation in the military setting, military emancipation, which is both a movement, first a movement to just confiscate people held in bondage on what they call the contraband policy, and then later with the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment to abolish slavery and to declare people forever free. The same people who had advocated for military emancipation in the locations where the Army had control in the South began to form the first Black regiments, and both in the occupied parts of the South and in states like Massachusetts and Ohio that recruit Black regiments, radical Republicans are at the head of the movement to make Black regiments and later to use their military service as a claim on citizenship, saying that Black men who had served in arms had the right to be recognized as citizens, also as voters. And both the citizenship campaigns and the first movements in the direction of enfranchisement of African American men, that all takes place during the war years. The most radical policies of the Civil War era Republicans were to confiscate and redistribute property, especially to redistribute property to people who had been held in bondage. And in certain locations, such as coastal South Carolina and Florida, such as New Orleans, and in the estates owned by Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, and his brother Joseph Davis, during the war years, the Lincoln administration and the Army did help to establish areas in which lands were confiscated and put into the hands of people who had formerly been enslaved. As you know, that 40 acres and a mule dimension of the radical movement gets a hearing in the Reconstruction period, and yet that never becomes fully the policy of the United States. And many of the wartime arrangements to redistribute property are reversed during the administration of Andrew Johnson. The last act of radicalism, which takes place off stage for my own book, mostly during the Reconstruction period, is to assist Black Americans in participating in elections, to defend their right to vote, to supervise elections in the southern states in the name of access for voters, and also to do what they can to build up educational opportunities and respect and comedy in race relations in the South. As you know, these initiatives will fail, but only after a kind of a glorious stretch when you compare it to everything that had come before. And so, whereas I think that there's plenty to say about the shortcomings, the shortfall of our expectations surrounding the radical movement, we have to, I think, recognize the greatness of the vision that begins at the very margins of society among people who don't have power, who ascend to power, who seize control, who act with great energy and really heroic commitment to address what they see as the fundamental challenge to the success of the American experiment. And so in my own reasoning, to celebrate these radical Republicans who have essentially not been celebrated, right? who were repudiated in their own time and greatly disparaged by more than one generation of historians and filmmakers, made to be the anti-hero of the story of Reconstruction, and never given any full celebration by the Republican Party that developed after Reconstruction. I think to recognize them is to give them their due, and it's also to disenthrall ourselves as a nation from the sort of pro-Confederate understanding that has been so influential in the way we see the Civil War and Reconstruction. I would love to talk to you about any of these things, and I sure hope that you do have some questions. So I'm going to ask Mark to manage. Hopefully
Right.
he's got a question.
Thank you, LeeAnna. And yes, if you got any questions, as you know, use the chat feature on the bottom, type it in there, and we'll do this. And as LeeAnna noted, one thing too I wanted to make sure and emphasize is that she covers 1854 to 1865, and we actually have a talk coming up in early January by a guy named Fergus Bordovich, who kind of picks up where she leaves off. So it's kind of a hand in glove set of talks here. Now, I wanted to talk about the percentage of radicals that made up the Republican Party, because it seems that the one issue that they all agreed upon was slavery is bad. We got to get rid of slavery, because the Republican Party had their own divisive issues within themselves. They didn't agree on tariffs. They didn't agree on economic, but they all agreed on slavery is bad. And so who were some of the people that you would categorize as quote unquote radicals? Because you have the one name you haven't mentioned so far, is I think some of you that you would identify as a centrist, that's Abraham Lincoln. So who would you classify as a radical?
Well, I do rad bait Abraham Lincoln all through my book, right? I try to present him as a guy who is open to overtures from the radical movement, and his vision is much broader than theirs. I don't want to suggest that he is right and that they are wrong, but he is a very strategic politician, and for the most part, they are not, right? Republican radicals are moralists, they're extremists. They don't have that sense of the give and take and building consensus that makes Lincoln such an incredible giant. And so the relationship between radicals and Lincoln is always fraught, right? He says, those guys are never nice to me. They've never been friendly to me. And he, at one point, also calls them the unhandiest devils in the world. And he's talking about the ones in Congress who do give him plenty of hard times. My book, part of what makes it an interesting pairing with Fergus Bordowich's book, your guest coming up next month, he's focused on Congress and the radical Republican movement in Congress. Whereas I have a few stories about Congress in my book, I'm actually a lot more interested in stuff that involves action, sort of out in the open. So not so much about parliamentary debates and legislation, or even about legal opinions, but about things like grabbing your family, moving to Kansas with a big stack of arms and ammunition, or serving in the armies of the United States and confronting slavery and taking action to check it. You know, like a story that I was awed by as I did research was about a Massachusetts doctor and officer, a guy named Edward Wild, who was stationed on the North Carolina coast and in Virginia in some of these oldest districts, right? Some of the earliest areas to be colonized by the English in North America. And these incredibly, established families, the first families of Virginia. And for him and others, including African Americans, he's a commander of black troops, to confront individuals with scars on their back, and then to capture and flog the men who had put those scars there, that there is, something about the Republicans in the field that attracted me. I was interested in the ones who were picking up the battering rams, shipping the boxes of Beecher's Bibles, labeled Beecher's Bibles, but they're really guns, recruiting African American troops, engaging as African American troops in combat, and advocating for their rights on the basis of that experience. That's what I was most interested in, the story sort of on the outside. That said, to answer your question about percentages, the radicals are a small faction of the representatives in Congress. Maybe there are 8 or 10 of them in the Senate, and maybe there are 30 of them in the House. But my argument is that the Army of the United States becomes a radical organization representing the Lincoln administration and its radical vision that the interests of Black people and the interests of the armed forces of the United States had become identical in the war setting, right? Something that U.S. Grant recognizes as early as 1862. And that remains the vision of the party, right? That the national interest and the interest of Black people in the South are indivisible. So even though numerically the radicals are not strong among elected Republicans, they are influential, in part because the war calls on their skill set, right? And their perspective is the perspective that's best equipped to win the Civil War. That brings them into the fore. And then, off stage from my book in 1865 and 1866, when the Democrats, when Southerners move to more conservative policies, they get huge congressional majorities in the 1864 and 1866 elections, super majorities like we've never had. And that's what creates radical Reconstruction. I saw a couple questions in the chat. Not to say you can't follow up.
Yeah, no. Were they known as radical Republicans at the time, or was that a moniker given to them later, or was it called was that going on in the 1850s, 1860s as well? And you also then mentioned that they were really pushing for war. I mean, expound on that a little bit.
Yes, they are happy to be called radicals, and the war policies. What I say in the book is the Civil War actually starts a lot earlier, right? The Civil War gets underway in 1856, if you're in Kansas. And what happened in Kansas was that militias formed that were actually the first units to be in fighting readiness. And so to a certain extent, these Civil War, these Free Kansas militias are going to continue their work right into the Civil War. John Brown, coming out of that Kansas militia movement, right? He's going to take the war into Missouri in the winter of 1858 to 1859. He will, with his followers, invade 2 plantations, seize 11 people, carry them across the United States in wintertime while 2 babies are born, to liberate them in Canada. For John Brown, the war began much earlier than 1861.
Yeah. As you notice, we got a couple of questions here. John C. Fremont was the first presidential candidate of the Republican Party in 1856. Why was he chosen to run?
Well, what I say is they choose him, and this was a typical 19th century thing. They choose him for what he is not, right? He is not a well-known radical Republican. He's not a well-known conservative Republican, because this is a big tent party that had all kinds. He had not been in the country in the lead up to the Civil War, and so he was not on the record for any of the touchy issues of that period, which allowed him to run as the guy who was just not well known. Sorry. not only do I have dogs, I got noisy kids. They've been doing pretty well. And Fremont is he's not an abolitionist. He's not a politician, right? He was a famous person, famous for his explorations, famous because he had played a key role in helping to make California a state and a free state. But he's actually not a guy who goes on the record making a lot of speeches. I present him in the book as kind of a disappointing person, even though he remains a real symbol of the radical political movement, especially since he's the first Civil War general to issue an Emancipation Proclamation. But what I say about Fremont is he's a lucky guy to have such a smart wife. And the role of Jessie Fremont, who was also a famous American, the daughter, a well-known daughter of a senator from Missouri, she's the real prize in that relationship. And people celebrated her. She was part of the campaign.
Yeah. By the way, you're with the dog and the kids. You're pointing out the upsides and downsides of technology and Zoom. Question here: were John Quincy Adams' actions as a congressman influential in leading to the formation of the Republican Party?
Well, that's a great question too. Obviously you're aware of John Quincy Adams' role in his post-presidential era as an advocate for abolitionism and as the champion in the famous Amistad court case in which rebellious, mutinous people being shipped, captives being shipped to be sold in Cuba, rise up. He is the visionary. He had passed away by 1854. But it was Adams who had issued the most elaborate statement about what wartime means for slaveholding. What Lincoln said about slaveholding was, it was so safe under the Constitution. It was so safe in our constitutional government that had so many layers of advantages built in for slaveholders as the Constitution was designed. And the only, it's true that Lincoln was committed along with other Republicans to putting slavery on a course for extinction. But he imagined that to be a course that he wouldn't live to see the end, right? That it would be the work of generations to terminate slavery gradually. And that the only real prospect for losing control of the slave system was to step outside of the Constitution, as Southerners did in seceding and forming the Confederacy. That was the only quick chance to terminate slavery. And it was John Quincy Adams who had actually observed that at length in a study, sort of historical parallels. If you look at what happened in Haiti, if you looked at what happened in the Spanish-American Wars for independence, wartime, if you look what happened in the American Revolution, right? Wartime means freedom is on the table for any Black man who can make himself useful to one of the military factions. And in fact, that's what happened in the Civil War. And so Adams is off stage. He is in that photograph, multi-party image of the eminent anti-slavery men, right? He's the most eminent at the top of that design, but he's not around to see the events of the 1850s.
Did the radical faction of the Republican Party support Lincoln in 1860 and 1864?
Well, yes. Although they have demands. In 1860, the sort of eminence grise, the old man of Congress among the radicals, I'm just forgetting his name right this minute, he'll threaten to march out of the Republican convention in Chicago unless the party includes in its platform an endorsement of the idea that all men are created equal, as stated in the Declaration of Independence. That had been part of the platform in 1856. They wanted to strike a more moderate note in 1860, and everybody knows what all men are created equal means, right? And it's a controversial idea. But ultimately, the party does include that plank in its platform. And in 1864, the radicals do subvert their suspicions of Lincoln only after a long flirtation with other candidates. For example, John C. Fremont, who they convinced to run. They don't have to twist his arm. He wants to be president. They have a counter convention and they nominate Fremont. But ultimately, his candidacy didn't prove to be very radical, didn't really gain a lot of support. And the radicals then go and talk him out of it in time to rally behind Lincoln in the 1864 election.
What's the role of Frederick Douglass with the radical Republicans?
Well, it's great to ask about Douglass, who, in his later life becomes well known as a Republican, right, as the Black Republican, and a guy who occupied a number of civil offices as a Republican appointee. It takes him a long time to warm up to the Republican Party movement. And he's not the only Black man who feels that it's pretty easy for Republicans to make claims about stopping the expansion of slavery. That actually doesn't make them a party for Black men. And the radical policies that blossomed during the War and Reconstruction are still in the future. Douglass and other Black men are skeptical. They remain skeptical through the war years. But radicals with ties to the Lincoln administration, Lincoln himself, they begin to recruit Douglass, right? Lincoln can see Douglass's gifts. He describes him as one of the most meritorious men in America. Of course, Lincoln also thinks that about himself, as he should, right? He, on his merits, has ascended to his high position. And he sees Douglass in the same way. He invites Douglass to the White House to speak to him. And Douglass also presents himself to engage with the president. And so he becomes a Republican. He becomes a dedicated, lifelong Republican, but he doesn't get there until 1863. So for the first 9 years of my study, Douglass moves in and out, but usually in a critical role, right? Usually trying to lash the Republicans to be braver, bolder, more effective.
Are there other characters that really jumped off the page to you as you were studying these people, this group? Was there a couple of personalities that really resonated with you, and on the flip side, was there a couple that you really didn't like?
Yeah, well, it's hard to like John C. Fremont. And another sort of unpopular guy in history is Salmon Chase, who was Lincoln's Treasury Secretary, who really felt he should have been president. He was a guy with a great pedigree as a radical Republican, but always came off as a little self-serving, maybe a little timid, always with his eye on the prize for himself. I was fascinated by James D. Lynch, whose image appeared at the end of the slideshow, his tombstone, for which the state of Mississippi in 1874 appropriated $1,000 to make a sculpture and a tombstone for this African-American legislature. That's the high regard that the Black and white members of Mississippi's Republican-dominated legislature had for James D. Lynch. And it was fascinating to see him as a kind of like a Forrest Gump kind of character moving through events in the Civil War era in a small way, but participating. He had been a missionary, one of several Black AME church missionaries sent into the South as an adjunct of the Army, right? Where the Army had control of territories, they worked with missionaries to establish Union-friendly churches. It was actually really important to military operations to have loyal prayers in church and to not have the churches as centers of, sedition. And toward that end, they shut down a lot of churches, actually, in places that they occupy. It's especially a problem for Episcopalians because I guess Episcopalians at that time included a prayer for the President of the United States as part of their liturgy. And the Army would go to services to see who was praying for Lincoln. If you're praying for Davis, they're going to shut you down. And when they shut you down, they were going to give your church facility to an African Methodist Episcopal church or to a representative of the Methodist Church North. In those days, they were divided into Methodist Church North and South. And James D Lynch establishes congregations. He establishes schools. He benefits from some of this confiscation and redistribution, right? The Army gives him an orange grove to support one of his schools for Black children. He's there when Sherman meets with Black leaders in Savannah to ask them what do they want, and they say, we want land. And the next day Sherman issues his Field Order 15 with the 40 acres and a mule policy. So I was fascinated by James D. Lynch. I was fascinated by Lorenzo Thomas, this sort of old, right? He's 60 years old, which is Civil War old, and elite, polished adjutant general of the Army, a desk man who's sent on a 2-year mission into the Mississippi River Valley, who recruits 80,000 African-American troops. I love that story. I see a question here about William Seward.
Yeah, I was just going to say, how active were William Seward and his wife in the radical Republican movement?
You know, William Seward was the radical darling of 1854, 1855, 1856, into 1860. The radicals love him because he was the guy who had said that an irrepressible conflict over slavery was looming. And so sort of he calls the shot that there's going to be a sort of a reckoning early in the 1850s, and that's bold politics. In truth, though, Seward is not truly, in his heart, a radical. And he's eclipsed by Lincoln in the 1860 convention, and then he serves Lincoln very well in basically a moderate role as Secretary of State, a role that he continues under Andrew Johnson after his assassination. And it's during that period that you see that Seward is actually kind of a conservative as he works with Johnson. So I don't actually give him a lot of turf in the story because I see him as being not very radical, but he is certainly a sincere anti-slavery activist. One way he comes into my story is as the sponsor for Harriet Tubman, someone who had sold her land at a good rate, who helped her care for her parents or helped her to get work, who stayed in touch with her, made connections for her as she offered her services to the Union Army during the Civil War and collaborated with radical Republicans in the effort to recruit Black troops.
Okay. I can't let you go without this question being asked because what kind of dog do you have?
Oh, I have to. Here he is. Come here, Darius. He's a cutie. This is Darius. He's a Shih Tzu. And as you see, he's got a bum leg. It's 20/20, even for my dog. But he's a good little history companion.
Yeah.
Although when I'm giving talks on Zoom, it's not his strongest moment.
Okay.
No doors are closed to this dog.
We're all navigating Zoom. How's it holding up in the high school level? Are you are you in person or are you virtual or?
Collegiate has a new building. We moved into the building in 2018, and because it is commodious, because it has a state-of-the-art HVAC, we elected to return 100% in person in the building. And that is a challenge because my 10th grade classes, for example, are divided into 2 classrooms. Half my students in this room, half my students in that room, and another group on Zoom. My other 2 classes I'm teaching down in the gym. We're all wearing masks, we're in our plexiglass boxes, we're 6 feet apart. We have to be on Zoom at school. That's how we do it, actually. We Zoom in person.
Well, thanks for being on Zoom with us tonight. We greatly appreciate this. Continued good luck with teaching, continued good luck with the book, and hopefully 2021 is better for you than 2020 has been for most all of us. So again, thank you very much for doing this. Thank you everybody for joining us. And good luck and good night.
All right. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.